Ukraine just brought the war right to the heart of Russia, hitting Moscow hard with one of the largest attacks on the country's capital since the conflict began. Despite encircling the city with a ring of radars and air defense systems, the Kremlin seemed to be caught off guard by this attack, with multiple explosions ringing out around the city and thick plumes of smoke captured on camera too. It's one of the clearest signs yet that Ukraine is in the ascendancy and Vladimir Putin has completely lost control of his own skies. The incident occurred overnight on October 26th into the early hours of October 27th, when swarms of Ukrainian drones crossed the border and made a beeline for the Moscow region and several other regions around western Russia. In total, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed to have intercepted 193 drones, including 40 over the Moscow region. The ministry went on to add that 34 of the drones in question were heading directly for the capital city itself when they were allegedly taken out, with several other regions including Kaluga, Bryansk and Tula also targeted. 47 UAVs were flown over the Bryansk region, 42 over the Kaluga region, 40 over the Moscow region, including 34 UAVs flying to Moscow, 32 over the Tula region, 10 over the Kursk region, 7 over the Oryol region, 4 over the Rostov region, 4 over the Voronezh region, 2 over the Orenburg region, 2 over the Tambov region, 1 over the Belgorod region, 1 over the Lipetsk region, and 1 over the Samara region. The mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, also confirmed that dozens of Ukrainian drones have targeted the capital. He posted online throughout the night claiming that the city's air defenses were successfully repelling all incoming threats, while also warning locals about the risk of falling debris, with residents urged to remain at home. Meanwhile, 2 of Moscow's 4 principal airports, Domodedovo and Zhukovsky, were forced to temporarily suspend operations due to fears of further drone activity in the region. There were no reports of any major damage in Moscow, and the Kremlin was quick to claim that it had successfully shot down Kyiv's drones. However, as we know from past experience, Russian officials tend to have a very loose relationship with the truth. Russia will happily twist the narrative and spin statistics to suit its own agenda, covering up the parts it doesn't want the public to know about. However, in the modern age of the internet, the truth always tends to come out in the end, and Russian social media sites were soon filled with panicked posts published by Moscow residents, along with photos and videos showing the city skyline thick with clouds of smoke rising up into the air. Locals also reported several loud explosions rocking the city's streets, and with close to 22 million people living in the Moscow metropolitan area, there's no telling how many of the city's inhabitants spent the night of October 26th in states of shock and fright, feeling just a small sliver of what innocent civilians of Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities experience on a near-nightly basis, as Russia's massive drone swarms and missile salvos rain down on their homes and surrounding structures. According to Russian channels, one of Ukraine's drones reportedly struck a high-rise building. However, analysts have also suggested this may have actually been the result of one of Russia's own air defense systems misjudging its trajectory and accidentally firing on a friendly target. While that may sound ridiculous, it certainly wouldn't be the first time that Russia's air defenses have made this kind of mistake. In fact, only a week ago, in early October, another devastating friendly fire blunder occurred, with one of Russia's Pantsir S-1 air defense systems launching a missile aimed at intercepting Ukrainian drones in the area. Unfortunately for Russia, the missile missed its target and was instead caught on camera arching through the air before falling down on an apartment block, resulting in a huge explosion that temporarily lit up the night sky before heavy plumes of smoke streamed out of the building. Another infamous incident occurred in 2023 when a Russian Su-34 fighter jet accidentally dropped a bomb on the Russian city of Belgorod, some 25 miles away from the Ukrainian border. The subsequent explosion left 3 people injured and damaged several homes and vehicles as well. So Russia absolutely has history when it comes to accidentally hitting its own people and infrastructure, and in a city like Moscow, which is so densely populated with so many high-rise structures all around, it wouldn't be surprising at all if an air defense missile accidentally missed its target and instead collided with a nearby building. Either way, despite the Kremlin's claims that the attack was entirely thwarted, it's clear that at least some sort of damage was done in certain areas of the city. Reporters at the Astra independent news agency even managed to track down the exact location where some of the thick plumes of smoke were rising into the air. Smoke is visible near the village of Kommunarka in Moscow after the explosions. Astra geolocated photos from eyewitnesses. On the night of October 27th, drones were shot down in the Moscow region, the Moscow mayor reported. Residents reported explosions in various cities in the Moscow region, including Moscow. In Kommunarka, part of Moscow, smoke was visible after the explosions, according to eyewitness photos. Astra geolocated the footage. It was indeed taken in Kommunarka, with smoke visible in the wooded area adjacent to Proyektorovany Drive. Astra was also able to obtain evidence of a fire breaking out elsewhere in the Moscow region. An oil depot caught fire in the Sepukov Moscow region. The fire has already been extinguished, but the cause remains unknown. On the evening of October 26th, a fire broke out in the area of Sepukov Oil Depot in Novoselky Street, according to an Astra analysis of eyewitness footage. The Sepukov city administration told local media that an empty fuel tanker caught fire, but the fire was quickly extinguished and no cause was reported. While this fire was not officially linked to the drone attack, it's highly likely to be related, especially given the fact that a fuel tanker caught fire, as Ukraine has made a habit in recent weeks and months of targeting fuel and oil-related locations and infrastructure in its deep strike drone attacks on Russia. Again, local officials were quick to downplay the incident, stating that the fire was swiftly extinguished and claiming that the tanker in question was empty at the time of the strike. However, as with all official Russian reports, it's recommended to take this one with a large pinch of salt, since the Kremlin so often lies and stretches the truth to suit its own agenda. Similar incidents played out in other regions, and Astra, among other news outlets, reported on them all. In occupied Luhansk, for example, the Ukrainian armed forces successfully struck not one but two oil depots, as confirmed by local occupying authorities. The attack damaged administrative buildings, several fuel trucks, and fuel tankers. Employees were promptly evacuated, and there were no injuries, said Andrei Alisiev, Deputy Minister of Fuel, Energy and Coal Industry of the LPR. In the Kursk region of Russia, meanwhile, a fire reportedly broke out close to a substation. Tonight, a Ukrainian drone attacked the city of Rilsk. The strike caused a fire in the outbuildings of a house located near a substation. Fire crews extinguished the fire, said Kursk Regional Governor Alexander Kinstein. In the Bryansk region, which sits just north of Ukraine and also borders Belarus, making it one of the most commonly targeted areas for Ukrainian and drone missile strikes, a minibus was allegedly struck, resulting in one fatality and several injuries, according to Astra reports. The minibus driver was killed as a result of a kamikaze drone strike on a moving minibus in the village of Pogar in the Pogarsky district, Bryansk Regional Governor Alexander Bogomaz reported. 5 passengers were also injured, all of whom were quickly taken to the hospital, he added. Given that Ukraine almost exclusively focuses on military targets or high-value infrastructure when attacking Russia, the minibus incident appears to be something of an anomaly. It may be that Russian officials aren't telling the full story here, or that the minibus was taken out inadvertently. Either way, Kyiv has yet to comment on this incident, but it appears that the vast majority, if not all of its drones, were aimed at military sites or critical infrastructure locations. Indeed, earlier in the day of October 26th, Ukrainian drones were spotted at several military airfields across Russia, including at least one in the Moscow region. Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation and Russian Media, confirmed the presence of Kyiv's drones in these locations, writing online, "In the Moscow region and other regions of Russia, military airfields are under attack." Russian media reports provided additional details, with some sources claiming that Ukrainian strike drones had targeted an airfield housing a variety of Russian aircraft, including Tu-160, Tu-95MS and Tu-22M3 strategic bombers. The reports didn't mention which airfield exactly was under attack, but given the available information released so far, plus the fact that there are only a few military airfields in the Moscow region, it's likely that this incident occurred at either the Chukalovsky airfield or the Kubinka airfield, or perhaps both. Explosions were also reported on October 26th at the Shaikovka airfield and Kaluga airport, both situated in the Kaluga region, southwest of Moscow. Shaikovka is reported to be the home of several Tu-22M3 bomber planes, while other military aircraft are also likely to have been present at the Kaluga airport as well. No further details have been released about what damage, if any, was done to the planes at these locations, but this all ties in with Ukraine's long-running campaign against Russian airfields and military bases, dating back to the iconic Operation Spiderweb attack of June 1st, 2025, in which 4 separate airfields were all targeted by Ukrainian drones, and a large number of aircraft were either damaged or destroyed, all in the span of a single day. Also on October 26th, Ukrainian forces carried out yet another successful strike, this time in the Belgorod region of Russia. The Russian forces have made relatively significant progress in recent days in their efforts to capture the Ukrainian city of Vovchansk, just over the border from Belgorod. The 16th Army Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces issued a statement online explaining the situation. The enemy tried to fully exploit a window of opportunity. After a dry period and an extremely hot summer, the Siversky, Donets and Vovcha rivers had dried up, simplifying logistics for the adversary. At the same time, reserves had been stockpiled and there were still enough leaves on the trees. Altogether, this led to a sharp increase in activity in the Vovchansk direction. As a result, the Kremlin's troops seemed confident of a crushing victory in the area, and Vladimir Putin himself was reportedly informed on October 26th that his forces had already occupied around 70% of the city of Vovchansk. Unfortunately for those Russian troops, Ukraine's forces were planning the perfect counter-operation. On the night of October 26th, they used drones to attack the nearby Belgorod Dam, which immediately began leaking water, flooding Russian dugouts, cutting several units off from their supply lines and putting some of the Kremlin's troops at risk of being quite literally washed away. Robert Magyar Brovdy, commander of the armed forces of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces in the 16th Army Corps, shared news and footage of the dam attack online. The Belgorod reservoir cracked today. Since the initial strike, the water level has dropped by 100 centimeters. The hit was carried out by the birds of the 1st Separate Center of the Unmanned Systems Forces, transformed from the 14th USF Regiment. Thanks to this attack, Ukraine's forces now stand a much better chance of strengthening their positions in the Vovchansk area, and Russian troops will likely find it far more challenging to push on and capture the territory it's been targeting in recent times. All in all, October 26th was a strong day as far as Ukraine's offensive maneuvers were concerned. The country's armed forces, and especially its drone operators, were able to strike at several regions around Russia and in occupied territories like Luhansk, dealing untold amounts of damage with fires and explosions breaking out in numerous locations. And even if Moscow didn't suffer any major damage, according to the latest available data and reports, the very fact that Kyiv is able to send dozens of drones into the skies over the Russian capital is a very big deal. It's a sign of how far Ukraine's armed forces have come. When the war began over 3.5 years ago, Kyiv was entirely and exclusively focused on defending its territory, holding its defensive lines and fending off wave after wave of Russian assaults and aerial bombardments. It had no chance and no time to even think about counterattacks, let alone direct strikes on Moscow, the beating heart of Russia's culture, government and higher society. Now, things have changed. Ukraine has solidified its defenses and found the time, resources and opportunities it needed to strike back at its enemy, carrying out an ever-increasing series of successful attacks not only in occupied regions, but deep into Russia itself, hundreds of miles beyond its borders. In doing so, Kyiv's forces are bringing the war home to the Russian people and to Vladimir Putin himself. For years, many Russians have been able to see the war as a distant conflict, one that doesn't have any direct, notable impact on their lives. This is especially true for many of those that live in Moscow, the richest city in Russia, where the quality of life is far higher than most other towns and cities across the country. There, the general public and Russia's elites have been allowed to go about their day-to-day lives, enjoying the comforts and luxuries the city has to offer, feeling a million miles from the chaotic and blood-soaked battlefields of Donetsk, Luhansk, and other occupied territories along the front lines. Many would never have imagined that they'd ever see the day when Ukrainian drones were buzzing above their heads or raining fire down on their capital city's streets. But that's all starting to change as Kyiv continues to push the boundaries and break new ground with its deep drone strikes. Now even citizens of Moscow, which is supposed to be Russia's safest stronghold, will start to think twice about stepping out of their homes in the evenings. They'll begin casting nervous glances into the air anytime they hear a vague buzzing sound, fearful that another Ukrainian drone might be around the corner. They'll check their phones and social media channels for news and updates of possible attacks or evacuation orders. Bit by bit, this will take a toll on their lives and their mindsets, and that's exactly what Ukraine is hoping for. Because when Kyiv conducts attacks of this kind, it's not purely hoping to deal as much damage as possible, starting massive fires and triggering devastating explosions. Instead, one of its main objectives is to make the Russian people see and feel the effects of the war firsthand. This, in turn, may gradually influence public opinion, pushing more and more people to condemn Putin's persistence and call for an end to the war once and for all. This is already starting to happen. A recent Russian poll carried out by the Levada Center found that support for the war has reached an all-time low, with just 27% of people feeling that the fighting should continue. 66% of Russians, meanwhile, believe that the time is long overdue for peaceful negotiations and a ceasefire agreement. More Russians also now feel that the war is impacting their lives, with 22% stating that the conflict has significantly affected either themselves or their loved ones, and 58% agreeing that it's affected them to at least some extent. Some have lost friends or family members in the conflict, for example, while others have felt their freedoms and financial situations worsen as a result of sanctions and restrictions related to the war. And if Ukraine's drones keep on appearing in Russia's regions, towns and cities in the weeks and months ahead, those numbers are going to rise. More Russian people will feel their lives directly impacted by the war. More will become fearful to leave their homes and go about their daily business. More will worry that they might be mobilized and sent to fight on the front lines against their will. And more will feel a growing sense of anger and resentment for the one man who started all this madness, and the one man who still, for now, has the power to stop it, Vladimir Putin himself. While Putin may not care much for the average Russian, he does care about power, and he knows he needs to keep a large part of the population on his side to maintain his powerful position. But the national mood is starting to sour as the economy weakens and millions of Russians grow sick and tired of a war that feels like it will never end. And with Moscow itself now under threat, smoke filling the city's skies and pickup trucks filled with armed guards aiming machine guns into the air right outside the Kremlin gates, the Russian president has never looked weaker. When NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte stood before reporters in London last week, his words marked a seismic shift in how the West views Russia's war machine. According to him, Vladimir Putin's Russia is running out of money, troops, and ideas. This was more than just geopolitics or optimism talking, but a one-line assessment of the slow but steady decline in Russia's military and geopolitical power. At the start of the war, Russia had the manpower, the resources, and the industrial capacity to plow through Ukraine. And even though those initial strategies turned out to be non-starters, Russia was considered to be the de facto winner of the war of attrition that the conflict seemingly devolved into as 2023 rolled in. But now, NATO is not so sure about that assessment, as battlefield reports are streaming in information about increasingly desperate measures from Russia, which point to the war in Ukraine slowly devouring Russia from within. The key supportive evidence for this has been pure battlefield wins that Ukraine has managed to eke out over the past few months. Notably, Russian forces had failed to take over the city of Pokrovsk for yet another year, being forced back several miles out of the city's boundaries, where they could then be pummeled by artillery fire. This key logistical hub in eastern Donbass, which Moscow has spent months trying to capture in a bloody assault, became the symbol of Russia's summer of failure. In mid-September 2025, The Telegraph reported that Russian units made up of soldiers infected with HIV, hepatitis, and other diseases had been spotted around Pokrovsk. Let that sink in for a moment. Putin's military has formed up units composed of soldiers infected with potentially deadly diseases and has sent them into battle. These soldiers wear armbands identifying them as carrying life-threatening diseases, a desperate attempt to create a moral and psychological pressure on Ukrainian defenders. Dmytro Zhmylo, executive director of the Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center, confirmed that these units are participating in fighting in what is currently the hottest spot of Pokrovsk. If this is what Moscow feels compelled to do to sustain its operational tempo, then the military is literally and figuratively running on empty. The situation around Pokrovsk tells the broader story of Russia's summer offensive. Roughly 16,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the area around the city alone since late August. Despite throwing massive forces at the city, Russian forces are making gains that are significant but likely do not portend the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in the area. Even when Russian forces managed limited penetrations, with several small Russian infantry units totaling some 200 soldiers evading defensive lines and established positions inside Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces have reportedly held defensive lines and inflicted significant losses on the Russians. Meanwhile, Ukraine demonstrated that it wasn't simply playing defense, as various reports of villages being recovered from Russia's control streamed through media channels throughout August. And in October, Ukraine fully struck back, with the 141st Mechanized Brigade carrying out successful assaults across the region. In total, it's estimated that Ukraine has managed to seize back control of roughly 24 villages. While the actual territorial gains aren't much to write home about, the principle is what matters, with Ukraine proving that it won't abandon this vital city and that it still has a few tricks up its sleeves to punish reckless Russian offensives. But while Pokrovsk accounts for much of Russia's current woes, as some reports suggest that around 40% of all fighting is happening there, the actual source is far away from Ukraine itself. It could be argued that the Russian failures inevitably stem from a military doctrine that was fundamentally unsuitable for modern warfare and interlocked geopolitical and economic ties. The problem begins with how Russia thinks about war itself. Putin's invasion wasn't actually planned by Russia's military command, but by the FSB, Russia's security services. Putin expected to take control of Ukraine within 10 days. Instead of a conventional invasion led by the entire military force Russia could muster, Putin planned what he termed a special military operation led by the Russian security services. As a result, Moscow has been shown via parades packed for victory celebrations practically before the operation began, all to showcase to the world how confident Russia was in its military and even geopolitical reach. But what didn't make it out of the country was spare parts for extended combat operations. Even more damning, captured maps from Russian mid-level commanders did not contain a decision to attack. Instead, there was a dubious decision to march in the absence of the threat of encountering the enemy. The reason for this was twofold. One, FSB falsely assumed that Ukraine's history of corruption and dissent for the government would carry over into Zelensky's term. With Ukraine flip-flopping between aligning itself with Russia in the West, some FSB officers compiled a report where a lot of Ukraine would simply welcome Russian officers and military with open arms. In that sense, Russia could use the same strategy as it did when it annexed Crimea over a decade ago. As we know now, however, Russia failed to realize the level of resentment that came from the annexation and the subsequent cold conflict. Secondly, Russia's previous large-scale conflict was fought way back in the 1980s, when the country was practically the leader of the Second World and still had the Soviet regime to back up its industry and military preparedness. After the dissolution of the Union, Russia's success in Georgia in 2008, in a protracted conflict with minimal troop requirements, led to the total dismantlement of countrywide mobilization efforts and supply channels. IFRI suggested that this ultimately caused Russian strategy to rely on wishful strategic thinking that is now obvious in hindsight when looking at the first few months of the war. So when reality hit, Russia had no contingency plans. The clearest example came at Hostomel Airport, just a few miles out of Kyiv proper. This operation was supposed to be Russia's only large-scale operation in Ukraine. The plan was to seize the airport, airlift reinforcements directly into Ukraine's capital region, and march on Kyiv before Ukraine could react. Instead, it quickly devolved into a disaster. Russia sent a forward force of between 200 and 300 special operations personnel aboard 34 helicopters from Belarus. On the Ukrainian side, around 200 conscripts from Ukraine's 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade were based on the airfield and had established defensive positions, armed with small arms, Soviet-era anti-aircraft missiles, and anti-tank weapons. Ukrainian defenders managed to shoot down 4 Ka-52 helicopters and an Mi-28, significantly disrupting the Russian assault and giving them a much-needed morale boost to see things through. Even more importantly, Ukraine had an inkling about the strategy, filling the airstrip with vehicles and downed aircraft, making it useless for landing reinforcements. So at the first sign of actual resistance, Russia abandoned all further plans. 18 Il-76 transport planes loaded with around 1,000 troops were spotted moving from Pskov, but none of the reinforcements would show up at the airport, likely being rerouted back to Russia or Belarus. This tactical failure revealed deep structural problems in how Russia thought about war. Russia's military suffers from a generational issue caused by its Soviet roots, combined with a deep resistance to external paradigms and adapting the doctrine to modern times and equipment capabilities. Unlike NATO forces, which institutionalize battlefield lessons, Russia defaults to predetermined scenarios in attritional warfare, recycling past models and relying on predictable mass mobilization over maneuver. There's chronic underdevelopment of Russia's non-commissioned officer corps, creating weak links between the higher officers, creating tactics, and the troops on the front, preventing them from fulfilling them. Additionally, Russia's defaults for the war assumed a terrain advantage in a defensive war against NATO, where it would use a combination of mechanized infantry and aerial support to deny air superiority and attrition the enemy on its own terms. Russia's rigid top-down command structure also left lower-level officers unable to make autonomous tactical decisions. This makes Russian operations inflexible by default, which means that once things start going wrong, Russian tactics have no way to compensate for sudden changes. So when Russia mounted an offensive war in Ukraine, it did so without managing to secure air superiority, since it didn't have the military and training structure to do so in the first place. The layered defenses provided by Ukraine then meant that most of Russia's air force would end up being underutilized until the development and proliferation of glide bombs in 2024. Meanwhile, Ukraine had been training with NATO forces since 2014, gaining years of experience in adaptive small-scale operations. When Russian units encountered unexpected resistance or changing battlefield conditions, they simply couldn't adapt. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, could improvise, innovate, and exploit Russia's predictability. But there's another, more insidious problem at play. Putin has spent 20 years systematically destroying any possibility of receiving accurate information or dissenting options. Putin truly believed Ukraine wasn't legitimate or independent without Russia. This was broadcast in his famous essay on the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians in July 2021, practically heralding the invasion. But more critically, for the past 20 years, Putin has done his best to dismantle any dissenting opinions from both his inner circle and his government. He is surrounded by people who either have the same ideological view as him or are so afraid of contradicting him that they don't show it. This created a catastrophic intelligence failure. Russian intelligence was providing assessments that were practically flights of fancy. The gathered data by the FSB was carefully filtered to create a picture that supported Putin's beliefs, namely that he was pushing on an open door in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Western intelligence knew exactly what Russia was planning. In November 2021, CIA Director William Burns traveled to Moscow to directly warn Russian officials against invading. In mid-January 2022, Burns visited Kyiv to personally brief Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on US intelligence assessments of Russia's imminent invasion. This intelligence sharing gave Ukraine a crucial advantage. Ukraine knew about the Hostomel airport assault. Ukrainian forces were prepared and waiting. Russian intelligence, by contrast, told Putin what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Putin's echo chamber creates a structural problem that goes beyond bad battlefield intelligence. Without opposition, Russia is forced to execute orders that are against its long-term interests. Russia could have probably backed out earlier and avoided the economic catastrophe that was coming, but admitting failure would require admitting the initial assessment was wrong, something Putin's system cannot tolerate. This creates dangerous instability within the Russian government itself. Putin's regime rests on perhaps just a few hundred key people in the security services, military command, and oligarchy. Currently, Putin's entire regime has such a stranglehold on these people that they have everything to lose and nothing to gain by trying to work against him. But if these people start fearing for their own safety or long-term prospects as the war drags on and economic conditions deteriorate, the entire structure could fracture. The regime that eliminated dissent to maintain control might find the same lack of dissent prevents the adaptation necessary for survival. And when that happens, those same people could start believing that Putin is no longer working in their interests, regardless of what that does to the country as a whole. Then, we could see Putin ousted or replaced by someone who can take the country in a different direction, or at least present a different face for Western politics to latch onto. This regime change could stem from Russia's economy being practically strangled by the war effort itself. For one, Russia's defense spending for 2025 is expected to exceed 8% of GDP and account for 40% of total federal expenditure, a record not seen since the Soviet Union's Cold War era and only matched by Ukraine, which is receiving multi-billion-dollar donations from NATO. This is a significant expansion from pre-war figures of around 22% of the government's budget going to the military. Russia has managed to do this with reforms and tax increases meant to sustain the economy throughout the war, but these are short-term efforts that have already started to show cracks. For one, Russia's oil and gas industry has stopped being such a prevalent contributor to the country's economy. The industry accounted for up to 50% of the revenue in the years before the war, and even up to 2024 as Russia funneled funding to evade sanctions and diversify exports. But that trade has now stagnated, with China and India commanding much lower prices for importing Russian crude, while also creating a practical duopoly on legal exports out of Russia. To bypass this, Russia has used its shadow fleet to transport oil through tankers to third parties, even including some European nations. However, the countries that do buy Russian shadow fleet oil have gone increasingly under scrutiny for doing so. EU members that have access to the Baltic, which holds major oil export ports for Russia, have started sanctioning more and more vessels and preventing Russia from using them in the fleet. At the same time, the EU imposing limits on Russian oil prices region-wide could lead to yet another dip in revenue. Secondly, Russia's military-industrial sector has turned almost entirely to fueling the war effort itself. A report by the Jamestown Foundation suggests a drop of 92% in arms exports between 2021 and 2024. That's removed practically all revenue that Russia was expecting from selling weaponry to allies like Iran, Syria, or India. Meanwhile, Russia has enacted domestic reforms that are indicative of imminent collapse. The country raised the tax on companies and incomes in 2024. In 2025, it will look into additionally raising the VAT on goods and services. The new plan for 2026 includes further increasing the tax on personal and corporate income, adding more tax brackets, and lowering the revenue threshold for companies needing to pay tax, significantly increasing the potential influx of money from its own citizens. While these all sound well on paper, the result is that people will be taxed more while also having fewer jobs all around, as the Russian military-industrial complex and recruitment drive are funneling more and more of taxpayer money into higher salaries and putting other industries out of business. And even then, the military complex is under increasing pressure from the state, since many contractors are forced to accept contracts at below-market rates or face criminal charges for failing to meet unreasonable demands. Putin has therefore effectively created an economic model that can only survive through continued warfare. Peace would expose just how severe Russia's economic and demographic problems are and force the government to confront the massive social problems it's created. But even these efforts are not working. Russia's ballooning economy has forced Putin to accept that he'd need to reduce military spending, with the most recent estimate being a reduction of around $6.3 billion in the 2026 budget compared to 2025. This doesn't account for the potential for inflation to make the problem worse. While Russia's war machine grinds down, Europe has emerged as the backbone of Ukrainian resistance in ways that threaten to permanently reshape the geopolitical landscape. The coalition of the willing is the first such fundamental shift in European security policy. Proposed by France and the United Kingdom in February 2025, the coalition currently contains 33 countries, with the US being one of the major absentees from the list. More particularly, the coalition stemmed from the US increasingly becoming disengaged with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, especially after Trump's second term started at the beginning of 2025. In July, the coalition reaffirmed its agreement to provide at least €40 billion in military support to Ukraine in 2025, matching the commitment made by the NATO alliance in 2024. A primary priority for support is the strengthening of Ukraine's air defense capabilities, with leaders agreeing for further support to deter massive Russian drone attacks and to increase financing for the production of drone interceptors. The coalition has become more of a funding mechanism. In the October meeting, the coalition members agreed to ramp up sanctions on Russia, forcing it to pay reparations and even directly increase the military pressure on Russia and ensure Ukraine's security after the war is ended. Perhaps most significantly, Europe is breaking its historical dependence on Russian energy. For decades, Russian gas and oil gave Moscow leverage over European policy. Some countries have even spent more on importing Russian oil throughout the war than they sent in donations to Ukraine. That leverage is evaporating. With each new sanction, that economic lifeline from the West is slowly being strangled to death, while support for Ukraine is increasing. Individual European nations are also making substantial commitments both to Ukraine and the coalition itself. France and the UK have been discussing expanding their nuclear deterrence to cover the rest of Europe, freeing American missiles from their stockpiles across the continent and making it less dependent on US policy. Germany has agreed to increase military spending and investment up to 5% of GDP, with roughly 1.5% used for creating and maintaining infrastructure. Romania and Denmark have created separate plans to directly support Ukraine's military procurement, the first by purchasing drones for both Romania and Ukraine, and the second by allowing Ukraine to build military factories inside Denmark. This European solidarity is precisely what Putin gambled wouldn't happen. His invasion was premised on the belief that Europe would fragment, with energy dependence trumping security concerns and moral obligations. Instead, the EU is now seriously starting to consider building a standing army that is on par with the US itself in terms of spending and military preparedness. And even if Russia somehow prevails militarily, the victory will be Pyrrhic to the point of being indistinguishable from defeat. The human cost of the war has been staggering. Western analyses suggest well over 1 million total casualties in the war itself, counting both severe injuries and deaths. But those casualties have an even greater effect on the domestic culture in Russia, as soldiers return home battered and broken from what they saw or did in the war. According to the Kremlin itself, by June 2025, almost 140,000 Russian soldiers will have returned to civilian life after fighting in the war against Ukraine in mid-2025. Many of these veterans are expected to suffer from PTSD and exhibit violent tendencies. By March 2025, veterans have killed and maimed more than 750 people inside Russia, with most common victims being relatives and friends. Russia's defense ministry has estimated that 1 in 5 war veterans suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, and more people have permanently left the army through other means. According to an investigation by Front Intelligence, at least 50,000 Russian soldiers had deserted by May 2025, with the company expecting a total of 70,000 desertions by the end of the year. Some Russian deserters have resorted to getting locked up, creating criminal cases that would result in sentences precluding them from ever serving in the military. At least then, Ukrainian holding prisons for prisoners of war have been considered to have much more favorable conditions than Russian ones. This represents the ultimate failure of military morale, when soldiers would rather surrender to the enemy than continue serving their own country. The economic devastation extends far beyond wartime spending. Russian authorities claim that just over half of the returning soldiers have found employment. Most of those jobs are in security or manual labor, paying just 40 to 60,000 rubles a month. Compare this to the inflated military salaries of over 150,000 rubles per month that were being promised left and right during the war. They simply won't be able to adjust and are more likely to re-enlist to get the higher salary, signing bonus, or injury compensation. The government has essentially created a military caste that can only maintain its standard of living through continued warfare. This is the death spiral that Putin has created. The war economy creates dependency on military service, where industries are slowly being shut down through internal competition and external sanctions. The only solution is more war, more recruitment, more economic militarization. Each turn of this spiral tightens the noose around Russia's future. The result could very well be the end of Putin's regime and even the Russian Federation as a whole.
Tanks and armoured vehicles have taken a beating in the war in Ukraine. Thanks to FPV drone attacks coming from both sides, Russia and Ukraine have both reduced the use of tanks and armoured vehicles from the eastern Ukraine front lines in the summer of 2025. Russia, in particular, has been rapidly withdrawing its expensive and rapidly depleting armour from the front lines, opting instead for offensive tactics using small groups of infantry rather than columns of armour. But as the cold, rainy season, or so-called Rasputitsa, sets in, the use of protective armour is becoming necessary again. And given the latest video emerging from the front, protection from the elements is the least of the concerns. In a shocking report from Zaporizhzhia, Ukrainian forces stopped a Russian armoured assault vehicle in its tracks. But before they could capture the surrendering elite Russian troops who survived the attack, Russian FPV drones appeared on the scene and reportedly took out their own troops. It's a blow not only to Russia's limited supply of armoured vehicles, but their equally limited supply of troops. First, setting the scene. According to a report published by pro-Ukrainian military blogger reporting from Ukraine, the debacle occurred on the approach to the settlement of Mala Tokmachka, a narrow, elongated village on the outskirts of the town of Orikhiv. Orikhiv is a key node in Ukraine's defensive line across southern eastern Zaporizhzhia, one of the most heavily fortified sectors between Russian-occupied territory and the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. It's a vital position for both sides, particularly as winter approaches. Neither side wants to be in icy dugouts outside the city, as opposed to the relative comforts of buildings inside the city, when General Frost inevitably makes his arrival. The same is of course true for every contested town and village across the front lines, but Orikhiv and its surroundings stand out on the map as a key target, both for the Russians to take and the Ukrainians to hold on to for dear life. Russia's Zaporizhzhia's offensive of 2025 has focused on three main trajectories. First, they've been trying to advance north towards the city of Zaporizhzhia from the vicinity of Kamianske in the Russian-occupied part of the oblast. But after some initial successes, including the capture of the settlement of Plavny, they've been more or less bogged down on the outskirts of Stepnohirsk for months. The second main direction of the Russian offensive has been towards the other major Ukrainian stronghold in eastern Zaporizhzhia, the small city of Hulyai-Pole. Here, they've ground their way into the Ukrainian fortifications to the east of Hulyai-Pole, taking some, if not all, of Poltavka and Malinivka in bloody battles. But they're still a long way from their main target. The third main direction is Orikhiv. The problem for the Russians here is that to both the east and west of Orikhiv are some of the densest Ukrainian defensive lines outside of Donetsk. There are no low-risk options available to approach it, which is why Russia seems to have decided that the direct line through heavily fortified Mala Tokmachka is probably the best card in a losing hand. However, Ukraine has successfully, and with relative comfort, kept Russian advances in this critical direction at bay throughout the summer. The best the Russians could do was manage to take Novopokrovka and reach within touching distance of Mala Tokmachka earlier in October. Now, the defences here are practically impenetrable without the use of armoured vehicles to bring infantry close enough to the Ukrainian positions to try and dislodge them. So, the Russians attempted an old-school assault using waves of armoured vehicles. Inside the vehicles, according to the report, were elite Russian units from the VDV, the Russian Airborne Forces. From the Russian perspective, to call what happened next a disaster would be a major understatement. Of the 26 armoured vehicles and tanks that attacked, 22 were destroyed by Ukraine during the course of the day. The attack seems to have taken place in waves rather than all at once. The geolocated footage provided in the report is of poor quality, so it's difficult to tell exactly what's going on. But in the segments provided, several units of burning and wrecked Russian armour can be clearly seen. Also visible are at least 2 Russian soldiers seen surrendering to Ukrainian forces. And this is where the story gets nasty. According to the report, the Russian troops who survived the destruction of the armoured vehicles and tanks were travelling in scattered groups in the fields. Some of them seem to have taken up basic defensive positions without much cover and with no support. Most were simply picked off by Ukrainian kamikaze FPV drones, with a few who remained opting to put discretion before valor and surrender while they still had the chance. But according to the report, before they could be captured, Russian kamikaze drones arrived on the scene and finished off their own troops. Very grainy footage appears to show one such soldier emerging from his position with hands aloft. He's being guided toward the Ukrainian rear areas by 2 Ukrainian soldiers who accepted his surrender and took him as a prisoner of war. Then, an equally grainy still image purports to show the drone attacking not the Ukrainian soldiers, but the Russians. It's not clear from the image whether the drone dropped an explosive onto him or flew into him, both of course being typical methods by which FPV drones kill people. Unfortunately, the image is just too blurry to tell. However, this is the second report of a Russian drone killing one of their own, attempting to surrender in the Zaporizhzhia direction in the past week. On October 22, the defense forces of southern Ukraine shared a video on Telegram that they say shows the same situation occurring, this time in Stepnohirsk. The video is much clearer than the one from Mala Tokmachka. A Russian soldier is seen, who certainly seems to be surrendering, but is clearly worried about a drone overhead. The drone then drops an explosive on him. The Ukrainian source said that the soldier had realized the hopelessness of continuing to fight and was putting down his weapon when a Russian drone dropped explosives on him, killing him instantly. The Ukrainian command said that instead of allowing his servicemen to survive, the operator of the enemy drone dropped an explosive device on him, instantly ending the life of the soldier who was trying to surrender. The post added that this incident is further evidence that the enemy does not value the lives of even its own soldiers and is ready for cruel actions to hide the manifestations of unwillingness to fight among its personnel. From the footage alone, skeptics might well ask how it's known it was, in fact, a Russian drone that took out the Russian soldier, and not a Ukrainian drone. It's impossible to tell just from the shared footage. The same is true of the video and stills shared from the failed Russian assault on Mala Tokmachka. Nonetheless, the report makes the same point. The incident shows just how little the enemy's command cares about the lives of its troops. And in this case, it's not just any old disposable troops being deliberately taken out by friendly fire. It's supposedly some of Russia's most elite fighting forces. The VDV is a rapid response force and strategic reserve within the Russian armed forces, established in 1992 following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They're an independent combat arm that reports directly to the Chief of the General Staff, currently Valery Gerasimov, and fall under the supreme command of President Vladimir Putin. The VDV are known by several nicknames, including Blue Berets, Winged Infantry, Troops of Uncle Vasya, and Angels of Death. Their motto is Nobody But Us. The Blue Berets nickname refers to their trademark ultramarine berets. They're sometimes compared to the US Marines due to their elite status and political influence. However, in terms of their operational doctrine and structure, they're much more closely aligned with NATO airborne forces, such as the US 82nd Airborne, France's 11th Parachute Brigade, or Germany's Fallschirmjäger. Similar to these NATO forces, the VDV are organized into airborne and air assault units, with a structure that includes divisions, brigades, and regiments at various operational levels. By 2024, the force had grown to around 60,000 personnel following Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Fully mechanized, it employs specialized airborne vehicles like the BMD series, offering superior firepower to many similar forces. The force includes elite units such as the 45th Guards Spetsnaz Brigade and the 11th Guards Airborne Brigade, and maintains training institutions like the Ryazan Guards Higher Airborne Command School, the VDV's Primary Officer Academy, and the Ulyanovsk Guards Suvorov Military School, which trains younger cadets. Their mission includes conducting independent operations or supporting larger army groups, and serving as a high readiness force for crisis response or strategic strikes. During the war, like so much else on both sides, their role has evolved. They've gone from traditional airborne assaults to include air mobile and mechanized infantry operations, and of course, the introduction of drone units, obligatory on today's battlefield in Ukraine. As such, they're considered to be a key instrument in the Russian General Staff's strategic toolkit, valued for their high readiness, mobility, and elite training, enabling them to respond swiftly to regional crises or conduct operations behind enemy lines. Well, at least that's the theory. In practice, needs change, and Russia has been forced to use them in far less than ideal roles. As far back as Ukraine's counter-offensive of 2023, Russia was already turning to its elite paratroopers to help defend against Ukraine's battlefield advances as a kind of regular infantry. War analysts at the time were already speculating that the VDV, reeling from past setbacks and failures, and battered and bruised from combat, might now be airborne in name only. At the time, then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that several actions were being taken to increase the combat potential of the VDV, such as the creation of new airborne assault units. Additionally, he said, Moscow would be adding support, repair, recovery and artillery capabilities to all divisions of the VDV, as well as new weapons and equipment. According to the Institute for the Study of War, these additional units, if indeed implemented, will likely allow the Russian military to use Russian VDV divisions almost interchangeably with motorized rifle divisions in the future, and VDV elements in Ukraine have been increasingly operating as combat infantry similar to motorized rifle divisions. But 2 years on, in the fields outside Orikhiv, it looks like that might just be a lofty way of saying the VDV has been converted into more meat for the meat grinder, and that they're fair game for Russian drones if they dare to surrender. So how can it be certain that the footage in the reporting from the Ukraine report definitively shows VDV forces being taken out by Ukrainian and/or Russian drones in the Ukrainian drones? It's frankly impossible to tell from the provided footage. It's just too grainy. But there are a few hints. First, those could well be the distinctive ultramarine berets on their heads. Now, other prominent Russian forces involved in Ukraine wear a similar color. The naval infantry or marines wear black berets, the interior troops berets are maroon, and the FSB border service wear green. Second, it's known that VDV forces are operating in the area. Recent frontline reports from the Russian side reveal that elements of the 7th VDV Division, including drone operators from the 108th Airborne Regiment, are conducting strikes near Primorske and Stepnohirsk in the Zaporizhzhia direction. Some of the units that were dispatched from the Sumy region to Pokrovsk in September may also have been redirected towards Orikhiv, at least if any of them are still alive. Ukrainian command claims that 14,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the Pokrovsk area alone since late August, claims that haven't been independently verified. Put all the evidence together and it does seem rather plausible that the footage does indeed show elite VDV paratroopers being thrown into the meat grinder, and if the claims of them being taken out by their own drones are true, they only add to a growing set of evidence presented by Ukraine that such punitive measures have been adopted by the Russian officers to prevent mass capitulation. As the report states, if the Russian command tolerates increasing numbers of surrendering soldiers, discipline will collapse further, and desertion and refusal will spread, leading to uncontrollable manpower losses. To prevent this, the officers tried to re-establish deterrence through public and private punishment, but at a steep cost. Taking out surrendering soldiers may slow the spread of capitulation, but they also indicate to recruits that officers care little for their survival. Potential volunteers or contract recruits watching these developments would be less likely to sign up, creating longer-term recruitment and readiness problems for an army that Ukraine and the Western media insist has been devastated by huge losses. Apparently, in addition to sustaining huge amounts of casualties, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky this week claimed the number of Russian casualties has risen to over 1.3 million. Russian desertion numbers are also growing fast. Based on a screenshot of a slide alleged to have leaked from an internal Russian presentation, Ukrainian military analyst Frontelligence extrapolated in March that the overall number of documented Russian AWOL cases had grown to 50,554 since the beginning of Russia's invasion. These numbers are validated to an extent by Russian court records, which show that over 20,000 criminal cases related to desertion, unauthorized absence, and disobedience were processed between late 2023 and May 2025. Reports indicate a sharp rise in such cases in 2024 and 2025, with some estimates projecting up to 70,000 desertions in 2025 alone, potentially affecting 10% of Russian forces deployed in Ukraine. On September 17, Putin told a meeting of parliamentary factions that some 700,000 Russian troops were deployed in Ukraine. So, what's driving the increasing number of desertions? Russia has strict penalties for desertion, including up to 15 years in prison for desertion, or it appears death by Russian kamikaze drone. Factors include heavy casualties, poor leadership, harsh conditions in penal Stormzy units, and growing disillusionment. Human rights group Get Lost has reportedly assisted between 26,000 and 48,000 Russians in trying to avoid or escape military service. However, as dire as this situation appears to be for Russia, Ukraine has its own much larger problem with desertion and unauthorized abandonment of positions itself. In response to an inquiry by Ukrainian news portal Ukrainian Truth, the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office revealed a few weeks back that Ukrainian law enforcement officers had opened almost 290,000 criminal cases for unauthorized abandonment of a military unit and desertion from January 2022 to September 2025. More than 235,600 cases were for going AWOL, with 53,954 for desertion. The number of cases has reportedly also surged in 2025, with sources like German newspaper Berliner Zeitung indicating that over the past year, twice as many soldiers have deserted as during the first 2.5 years of the war. Some 29,000 soldiers have returned to their posts following the Ukrainian government's implementation of a simplified return to post process without prosecution, but they still seem to be leaving at a far greater rate than they're returning. The reasons cited for these massive figures are similar to those cited for Russia's high and growing desertion rates: fatigue, insufficient training, unclear terms of service, frustration, shortages, low pay, corruption, and weak military leadership or serious distrust of commanders whose orders often lead to heavy losses. Ukraine's problems with mustering up sufficient manpower to not just defend the front lines, but push Russia back have been well publicized. The desertions only add to its problematic mobilization efforts. In January, the Kyiv Independent reported that nearly 6 million Ukrainian men had not updated their information in military enlistment centers, and that most of them likely don't have grounds for a deferment or exemption. This suggests that a large number may be avoiding contact with authorities to evade mobilization. Add public resistance to mobilization and Ukraine's reluctance to conscript under 25s to the mix, and the desertion problem becomes even more acute, especially since Ukrainian forces are already outnumbered. In September, Oleksandr Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, stated that Russia outnumbers Ukrainian forces 3-1 overall, and on the main fronts by 4 to 6 times. If Russia has 700,000 troops on the front lines, that implies Ukraine has roughly 290,000 active personnel currently engaged in combat. So, both sides are making a big deal about the other's desertions and what it says about their tactics and lack of concern for the fate of frontline soldiers. In fact, if analysing the differing accounts of what's happening in the war generally, one might get the impression that they're observing two entirely different conflicts. Gerasimov told Putin on October 26 that up to 5,000 Ukrainian troops were encircled near Kupiansk and up to 5,500 in and around Pokrovsk. Russian-aligned mappers seem to validate at least the territorial claims. Zelensky called the claims a complete lie and not the first. Mappers like Deep State and the Institute for the Study of War agree, painting a very different picture. It's a similar story around Mala Tokmachka, where the Russians claim to have established a foothold in the town, from where a bridgehead into Orikhiv can be developed. If that's true, perhaps it's as a result of the 4 armoured vehicles that weren't destroyed by Ukrainian forces in our featured report. Perhaps they managed to land some VDV troops, who were then able to secure some positions in the town. But Ukraine denies there's any Russian presence there, and if Kyiv's assessment is correct, it only underscores just how badly the Russian offensive in Zaporizhzhia is faltering. Moscow's forces have thrown elite paratroopers, armor, and even their own drones into the fight, only to lose them all in the same fields they hope to capture. It's another sign that Russia's so-called elite forces are being ground down piece by piece by their own chaos. Russia just tested its nuclear-powered Burevestnik cruise missile. Boasting almost limitless range and incalculable destructive firepower, the missile has been called invincible by Vladimir Putin and described as a flying Chernobyl by the head of the Russian army. On paper, it's one of the most powerful weapons in the world. In practice, it's a complete and utter disaster, a pointless power play with almost zero real-world value and a grim history filled with failure and chaos. This is the full story of the 9M730 Burevestnik missile, including the parts that Putin doesn't want anyone to know. It may have only just completed its first record long-distance test flight, but the Burevestnik, also known under its NATO name Skyfall, has been in development for decades. In fact, Professor Mark Galeotti, a leading Russia analyst and researcher at the Royal United Services Institute, believes that the project first started during the Soviet era, stating, "These new systems have their origin in Soviet times. They've been taken off the shelves and given new investment." In 2001, around the same time that the United States was preparing to exit the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and only 1 year into the Putin regime, Russia made the call to revive this decades-old project. Building on the foundations established in Soviet times, it started work on a new kind of missile, a nuclear-powered cruise missile capable of penetrating any interceptor-based missile defense system and traveling vast distances to strike any location anywhere in the world. On the one hand, it's easy to understand why Russia would want to develop a weapon of this kind. Conventional rocket-propelled missiles always have a limited flight time and range. They're always restricted in some way by the amount of fuel they can carry. A missile like the Burevestnik is completely different. While it's not entirely known exactly how it works or what inner mechanisms and core components it might have, it's known it's powered by its own nuclear fission reactor and most likely a ramjet engine. The way this works is quite simple in principle. As the missile flies through the sky, air is forced into the engine's inlet. That air is then heated with the aid of the nuclear reactor, which causes it to expand at incredibly high speeds and leave the engine via a nozzle at the rear, providing thrust for the missile to continue its flight. With a system like this, a nuclear-powered missile can theoretically fly much further and for far longer periods of time than any conventional counterpart. It can, in theory, launch from one location, travel thousands of miles to the other side of the Earth, take evasive aerial maneuvers to avoid enemy air defenses, and even loiter in place for several hours, if not longer, before finally striking its target. This opens up unprecedented opportunities for any military force in control of such a weapon. They would have the power to attack any enemy or piece of infrastructure anywhere in the world at any time they like. It would be an almost unparalleled deterrent, especially if equipped with a nuclear warhead. There's just one problem. The United States, the world's leading military force, already attempted to make a missile like this almost 70 years ago, and it ended up abandoning the project after seeing how chaotic and dangerous it turned out to be. During the 1950s, the US Air Force started looking into the concept of using nuclear-powered aircraft and missiles as part of its aircraft nuclear propulsion project, and the idea of using a nuclear ramjet engine was first explored in the mid-50s by two of the country's top engineers at the time, Frankie Rom and Eldon W. Sams, of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Lewis Research Center. Around the same time, the United States Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, was also studying the prospect of using a nuclear rocket as the upper stage of an intercontinental ballistic missile, effectively looking at ways to harness the unique capacities of nuclear power to make missiles that could go further and travel longer than any others ever invented. On January 1st, 1957, the AEC and the Air Force took the next steps. They launched Project Pluto and instructed engineers at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, California, to actually construct and test the world's first nuclear ramjet engine capable of powering a supersonic low-altitude missile, SLAM. Project Pluto proved to be a gigantic undertaking. Whole new facilities had to be built to highly precise specifications to minimize the risk when working with highly radioactive components. This included a special disassembly building named Building 2201, which had walls up to 8 feet thick in places, along with 4-foot thick lead glass viewing windows, and even a specially prepared fallout shelter nearby that the scientists could retreat to in the case of a major nuclear catastrophe. The research complex even had to have its own specially built railroad system to transport the radioactive test reactors to and from the test site. It cost $1.2 million to construct the necessary facilities, which would be closer to $12 million today, and the work had to be carried out with the utmost of precision and care, as a single error, oversight, or miscalculation could have caused a major disaster. Fortunately, the right people were picked for this project and managed to complete work on 2 experimental engines, codenamed Tory 2A, which was the world's first nuclear ramjet engine and tested in May 1961, and Tory 2C, which was significantly larger and tested in May 1964. Both engines worked, so the tests were successful. to a certain extent. However, on July 1st, 1964, 7.5 years after Project Pluto began, it was officially cancelled. There were three main reasons for this. First, intercontinental ballistic missile (ICBM) technology developed much faster than many military experts had anticipated. This effectively reduced the need for nuclear-powered cruise missiles, since ICBMs had many of the same advantages. They could travel incredible distances to strike targets all over the globe and were also able to move at remarkable speeds, several times faster than the speed of sound, to help them evade enemy air defenses. In fact, compared to conceptual nuclear-powered cruise missiles, ICBMs are faster and less vulnerable to interception by enemy air defenses. Second, there were blatant environmental and public safety concerns regarding the testing, storage, transport, and usage of nuclear-powered missiles. While working on Project Pluto, scientists found that the unshielded design of the nuclear reactors led to lethal fission byproducts like cesium-137 and iodine-131 being ejected into the atmosphere via the engine's exhaust plumes. In other words, a missile like this had the potential to contaminate everything along its flight path, poisoning ecosystems and spreading radioactive pollution far and wide. This made testing it almost impossible, as officials weren't able to identify any reasonable, safe or suitable location to use. Third, and perhaps most important, there were simply too many risks and unpredictable variables involved in working with nuclear-powered engines and other components. The risk of the missile crashing and causing a major disaster was too high, and the engineering challenges involved with making and maintaining air-breathing nuclear engines were enormous. Costs spiraled, and despite their successes, the development team faced countless issues along the way, including material corrosion caused by neutron flux and malfunctioning electronic systems. Weighing up the increasingly small pros and relatively huge cons, the US Department of Defense made the obvious decision to scrap the project, shifting its focus to much more reliable, stable, and affordable ICBM technologies. The US is the most powerful military in the world and has been for generations. It doesn't make decisions lightly, and it wouldn't have given up on a plan like Project Pluto without strong, solid reasons. Thus, Russia could and should have learned an obvious lesson from this story. It should have understood that nuclear-powered missiles were neither feasible nor sustainable, and it could have saved itself a huge amount of time, money, and hassle by following America's example and moving on to other areas of development. Instead, Putin made the call to revive the project, unknowingly setting into motion a series of devastating events that would see several people killed. Since work on the Burevestnik recommenced, the missile has undergone several failed test flights. In November 2017, for example, a missile was launched from the Pankovo test range on Yuzhny Island in the Arctic Ocean. It flew for a measly 2 minutes, covering around 21 miles before crashing into the Barents Sea between Norway and Russia. There were numerous other reports of failed flights too, with around half a dozen Burevestnik missiles said to have veered widely out of control and off course after their propulsion systems faltered and nuclear reactors destabilized, with several ending up in the depths of the White Sea just off the northwest coast of Russia. Every time this happened, radiation was released into the surrounding environment, with numerous harmful elements including tritium and cesium seeping out into the air, ice and water, poisoning local wildlife and polluting ecosystems for years to come. As usual, the Kremlin has done its best to cover up these catastrophes, and in March 2018, seemingly undeterred by the missile's many failures up to that point, President Putin took to the stage for his annual State of the Nation address, officially unveiling the Burevestnik to the Russian public and the wider world. Introducing the missile's capabilities, Putin said, "We started to develop new types of strategic arms that do not use ballistic trajectories at all when moving toward a target, and therefore missile defense systems are useless against them, absolutely pointless. One of them is a small-scale, heavy-duty nuclear energy unit that can be installed in a missile like our latest X-101 air-launched missile or the American Tomahawk missile. A similar type, but with a range dozens of times longer. Dozens. Basically, an unlimited range." The Russian president went on to show an animation of the missile in action, going on to claim that the missile had already been successfully tested. It is a low-flying stealth missile carrying a nuclear warhead with almost an unlimited range, unpredictable trajectory, and ability to bypass interception boundaries. It's invincible against all existing and prospective missile defense and counter-air defense systems. I will repeat this several times today. During its flight, the nuclear-powered engine reached its design capacity and provided the necessary propulsion. Now that the missile launch and ground tests were successful, we can begin developing a completely new type of weapon, a strategic nuclear weapon system with a nuclear-powered missile. Putin has long been a master of propaganda, and his speech painted a picture of a groundbreaking, game-changing weapon. In reality, the Burevestnik was still quite literally struggling to get off the ground at the time he gave this speech, and 1 year later, things were about to get much worse. On August 8, 2019, the Burevestnik program encountered its biggest and costliest disaster at the State Central Navy testing range near Neonoxa on the White Sea. There, specialist ships had been deployed to recover one of the many missiles that had crash-landed into the water. While attempting to lift the submerged prototype from the sea floor, a liquid fuel booster linked with the missile's nuclear core detonated when it came into contact with the atmosphere. The resulting blast killed 5 technicians in the blink of an eye. Additional reports suggest that 2 or 3 more personnel later died from radiation-related complications, bringing the total number of fatalities to roughly 7. Those affected were said to have suffered symptoms consistent with acute radiation exposure, including dermal necrosis, gastrointestinal hemorrhages, and multiple organ failure. Other personnel at the site of the incident were exposed to exceptionally high and dangerous doses of ionizing radiation, going on to suffer severe sickness, burns, nausea, and other effects. On top of that, many of the emergency workers, including first responders and paramedics who were dispatched to the scene, were not given proper warnings or informed about the nature of the accident. As a result, they too were exposed to nuclear radiation, with several reporting elevated white blood cell counts and potential long-term health risks that have not been publicly documented. Fallout from the explosion led to several dangerous elements spreading across the surrounding environment, including strontium-91, barium-140, and lanthanum-140 isotopes. Gamma radiation levels spiked in towns and cities miles away, like Severodvinsk, which was around 19 miles from the blast. It was a complete catastrophe, with innocent lives lost, countless people put at risk, and ecosystems poisoned for years to come. After an event like that, many military generals and world leaders would have made the right decision. They would have called off the program there and then, coming to the logical and clear conclusion that it was simply too dangerous to persist with. But not Putin. The Russian leader has always displayed a callous regard for human life. He cares little about the deaths of ordinary Russian citizens or the destruction of the natural world. As long as he maintains or expands his grasp of power, it doesn't matter how many lives are lost or what price the population has to pay. So, unsurprisingly, he made the call to push on with the project. Even when meeting with widows of those who had lost their lives, he reportedly said, "We will certainly be perfecting this weapon regardless of anything." In other words, he didn't care how many people died in the White Sea disaster, or how many more might perish in subsequent failures. He wanted his missile, and he'd stop at nothing to get it. So, development continued, leading all the way up to the present day and the very recent long-range test flight of the Burevestnik missile. On October 26, alongside the head of his army, General Valery Gerasimov, Putin confirmed that the missile had completed a 14,000 kilometers, 8,700-mile Arctic flight. "I clearly remember that when we announced the development of this weapon, even very high-level, top-class specialists told me the goal was worthy and respectable, but unattainable in the near historical perspective. Once again, that was the view of those high-class experts, and now the decisive tests have been completed. Obviously, substantial work has to be done in order to place this weapon on combat duty, and all regulations must be completed. Nevertheless, as I understand it, the key objectives have been achieved." Putin went on to boast that this is a unique product that no one in the world has, before announcing, "We will need to determine which class of weapons this new system belongs to, identify possible modes of employment, and begin preparing the infrastructure to base it in our armed forces." General Gerasimov, meanwhile, somewhat bizarrely compared the missile to a tiny flying Chernobyl, referencing the famous nuclear power plant that's best known for the 1986 disaster in which one of its reactors exploded. Nuclear military experts around the world have responded to the news with a mixture of shock, outrage, and disdain. Jeffrey Lewis, a nuclear non-proliferation expert at Middlebury College, stated, "This is a bad development. It's one more science fiction weapon that's going to be destabilizing and hard to address in arms control." Writing in the Kyiv Post, Chuck Farah, a former squadron leader with the US Navy SEAL Team 6, shared his view. In reality, the Burevestnik represents a Frankensteinian folly, a revival of a doomsday concept the United States abandoned decades ago as dangerous and unworkable. In a desperate bid to project power amid mounting battlefield defeats and economic isolation, Russia has grown perilously irresponsible, resurrecting this Frankenstein's monster at the cost of lives and legacies. Farah went on to note that according to experts, the unshielded design of a missile like this is utterly unworkable. It will never be made entirely reliable or safe, and if Russia continues to test it, widespread radiological contamination will inevitably ensue. The Burevestnik is not a strategic asset but a useless, dangerous and deadly stunt. Its very flight path a toxic scar on the fragile Arctic environment where melting ice amplifies radionuclide spread to global currents. But perhaps the biggest, boldest and most damning reaction of all came from the US President Donald Trump. Speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump was asked about Russia's recent test of the Burevestnik and replied in no uncertain terms,
"They know we have a nuclear submarine, the greatest in the world, right off their shore. So, I mean, it doesn't have to go 8,000 miles. And they're not playing games with us. We're not playing games with them either. We test missiles all the time. I don't think it's an appropriate thing for Putin to be saying either, by the way. You ought to get the war ended. A war that should have taken 1 week is now in its soon 4th year. That's what he ought to do instead of testing missiles."
Trump's view is clear. If Putin plans to play mind games or intimidate the Western world with this new weapon, he's going to be sorely disappointed. As the US president notes, America has plenty firepower of its own, with a vast nuclear arsenal, world-leading missile technologies, and nuclear-powered submarines stationed in strategic locations around the world. It has no reason to fear Putin's new missile, especially given the weapon's disastrous track record so far. And with Russian forces continuing to flounder in Ukraine, the Kremlin is quite frankly humiliating itself by boasting about brand new missile technologies when it can barely capture and hold cities in a war against a much smaller opponent. All in all, this simply feels like another example of Putin's hubris getting the best of him. And while the Russian leader may think he's projecting power by dressing up in combat fatigues and boasting about the range of his fancy new missile, he has in fact never looked weaker or more vulnerable than this. Now, learn more about Putin's desperation in this video, which looks at how Russia recently staged a fake victory in Ukraine in order to convince the world it's winning the war. Or check out this video to see how even Ukrainian farmers are finding ways to outsmart Russian forces, proving that the Kremlin's war machine is a much weaker and tamer beast than anyone could have imagined. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, to be among the first to find out about the latest breaking news and big developments from the Russia-Ukraine war.